guests, ladies and gentlemen. You have here the panelists are just before you. We have in chair and moderator Mr. T.N. Ninan, President of the Editors Guild of India. Ms. Kirsty Hughes, Chief Executive Officer, Index on Censorship, London. She's here. We have Mr. Ajit Balakrishnan, CEO, next to me, of Ajit Balakrishnan, CEO of Reddit.com, sitting there. You have Sunil Abraham, Executive Director, Center for Internet Society. Mr. Timothy Garton Ash, Director of Free Speech Debate, Oxford University, and Mr. Ramanjit Singh Chima, a Senior Policy Analyst with Google, based in Delhi. A warm welcome to you all to this joint seminar of the Editors Guild of India, Index on Censorship, London, and India International Center on the topic that you see on the backdrop. Is freedom of expression under threat in the digital age? That is the question. The topic is under intense debate all over the world. It assumes importance in the light of various methods being adopted by authorities to enhance cyber policing against this medium. However, the figures published on 11th January, a few days back, indicate that today 1 billion people use Facebook, 500 million use Twitter, Google Plus is being used by more than 500 million, and LinkedIn has crossed the 200 million mark last week. The internet revolutionary communication system has used daily by billions of people the world over has turned 30 on 2nd January this year. To discuss the topic, we have Kirsty Hughes, Chief Executive of Index on Censorship, London. She will begin her work in the middle of April, leading a team of 20 in Index's London office. Kirsty distinguished career has taken her from Chatham House to the Institute of Public Policy Research and the European Commission. More recently, she was head of global policy research, public policy research and advocacy at Oxfam. Currently, Senior Associate Fellow at the Center for International Studies, University of Oxford, Kirsty is also an experienced writer, policy analyst, a journalist who has written extensively on European and international politics. We have with us Mr. Vivek Mehra, CEO of the Sage, who is supporting the index. Ajit Balakrishnan needs no introduction. Many of us carry our email IDs with Reddit.com. He is the founder, chairman, and CEO of Reddit.com, an internet company based in Mumbai, which has become highly successful internet portal. He is currently chairman of the Ministry of IT's Committee on Internet Governance and Proliferation. He was recently named as the chairman of the Internet and Mobile Association of India. Professor Timothy Garton Ash, far left to me, is a world-famous historian, author, and commentator. He has written extensively about the communist dictatorships of Central and Eastern Europe and the experiences with the secret police. He heads Free Speech Debate project at the University of Oxford and teaches European studies. He has examined the role of Europe in an increasingly post-Western world and challenge of combining freedom and diversity, especially in relation to free speech. A former foreign editor of The Spectator and a columnist for The Independent, Mr. Ash is long-term contributor to the New York Reviews of Books. His column is also translated in Turkish daily Radical and in the Spanish daily El País, as well as other papers. We have policy advisor. We wanted to have policy advisor from Google for Asia Pacific, Mr. Lokman Su, but he has not been able to come because he has some trouble with the visas. Anyway, we have from Google, Mr. Ramanjit Singh Chima, a senior policy advisor, policy analyst based in Delhi. In the National Law School of India, Bangalore, he was the chief editor of volume 5 of the Indian Law Journal and Technology. He has studied internet regulation as an independent research fellow with the Sarai program of the Center for the Study of Developing Societies, and contributed to Freedom House's 2009 Freedom on the Internet project. And we have Sunil Abraham, Executive Director of Bangalore-based research organization, the Center for Internet and Society. He founded Mahiti Infotech Project Private Limited in 1998, a company committed to creating high-impact technology and communication solutions. Between 2004 and 2007, he has also managed the International Open Source Network, a project of UNDP's Asia Pacific Development Information Program, serving 42 countries in Asia Pacific region. I would now invite Kirsty Hughes to make brief remarks, after which I would hand over the debate to Mr. Ninan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a huge pleasure to be here, and it's a huge pleasure to be doing this event jointly with the Editors Guild of India and the Indian International Centre, and with the support of our magazine publishers, Sage. I'm not going to make a speech. You may be glad to know about Index on Censorship and our history, but some of you will not have heard of us, even though it is our 40th anniversary. We were set up 40 years ago as a magazine, and we're still in part a magazine today. We were set up then to combat censorship. We published a lot of samizdat back then, and we're still campaigning and writing about and against censorship and in favour of free speech today. And we're based in London. We do that around the world.
Check whether your mic is on.
The green light is on. So I just wanted to add my welcome and to say how delighted I am to see so many people here tonight interested in this issue, and I look forward very much to hearing my fellow panelists.
Good evening, friends. The Editors Guild of India is very happy to partner with the Index on Censorship, a very current and relevant topic, which is whether freedom of expression is under threat in the digital age. Even as we speak, the two young girls who were initially arrested for some innocuous postings on the social media and then released because there was an outrage. The charges have still not been withdrawn against them. We have television journalist Naveen Surinje, who is in jail for now over 2 months in Bangalore because he reported on a certain group attacking a homestay in Bangalore, and instead of being rewarded for his work, he has been charged under the criminal code for being one of the perpetrators, and bail has been denied to him. So there are several issues. We know about the cartoonist, we know about the two professors in Jadavpur University. We know that the number of restrictions or things removed from social media in India are among the highest in the world. So there are lots of issues which face us, and most importantly, the government's continued defense of Section 66A of the Information Technology Act of 2000, which is open to gross misuse, as we've already seen, but which the government has not agreed to amend. We tried very hard to get a spokesman or somebody responsible from the government to be on this panel today so that we could debate the issue, but that unfortunately has not been possible. Nobody would come. The question on, if I may just take half a minute more before I start with the panel, the question of whether freedom is absolute or relative is a question that I expect will come up. President Obama had passed a law a couple of years ago, I think, banning the use on TV or in any electronic media of visuals showing deliberate cruelty to animals. So is that kind of a restriction legitimate? Is it not? There are people who argue both views. You can argue whether the right to offend religious sentiment is a fundamental right or not. Issues to do with whether the digital media is treated differently from the print media. All these questions, I hope, will come up in the course of our discussion. Panel of 5 people. It's now 6:40 and we have to wind up at 8. And if we can leave the last half hour for discussion and questions from the floor, which the panel will respond to, basically we have about 50 minutes. So panelists can be briefer if they want, but 7 to 10 minutes per panelist, I think, would be about right. And I would from Bangalore, who runs the Center for Internet Society, and does some very sophisticated work in lots of related areas, which I won't go into here, except to say that he's somebody who's devoted himself to this field with great dedication, and we're very happy to have him here. Sunil?
Thanks, Ninan. I'm not sure to what degree I will disagree with the other panelists up here in front. So I thought I should look for these disagreements actively. So I will do 3 things in my presentation. I will present a critique of the idea of internet freedom. I will look at some of the unintended consequences of censorship. And then I will tell you a story about monkeys. To begin with, internet freedom. This is a term that is mostly popularized by Hillary Clinton and her team at the US State Department. If you ask corporations like Google, and Raman is here to talk more about Google's perspective, what internet freedom means, they will say it means hands off the internet. That's what they think it means. What they usually really mean by that is hands off Google. They don't want governments interfering with large corporations like Google. But what is particularly strange about this civil liberties promotion from the US State Department is 3 very specific things. Number 1, it is a technology-specific civil liberties agenda. You never hear the US State Department extend the argument to television freedom. You never see Hillary Clinton talking about how television should be uniformly free across the world. If you turn on your television set in any US hotel, you will notice, just in terms of choice, you don't have the 600 channels you will get in an Indian hotel. You don't have multiple religions represented in terms of evangelical preaching. You don't have linguistic choice. You don't have programming choice, etc. So America is very keen, because it suits them at this particular historical moment, to evangelize internet freedom, and then they find common cause with large American intermediaries. So we must think through that question a little carefully. The second element to the American internet freedom rhetoric is it does not include access to knowledge. If you read Article 19 very closely, then you realize... Closer? Okay. Then you realize that in order to express oneself, in order to have free speech, then you also need one precondition, and that is the precondition of access to knowledge. And most recently, if you are on Twitter, you would notice that one very important internet hero has committed suicide, Aaron Swartz. And this was for retrieving more than 5 million scholarly articles from JSTOR, which is a scholarly database. All these 5 million articles had already expired in terms of copyright, and all Aaron Swartz was hoping to do was place articles that are already in the public domain, but behind proprietary walls onto torrent networks like the Pirate Bay. JSTOR, which has Lawrence Lessig on its board, withdrew charges, but the American prosecutors decided to continue and heaped all sorts of charges against Aaron Swartz. Some of these charges would have got Aaron Swartz 30 years in jail. And Aaron Swartz committed suicide. And again, you can see Hillary Clinton did not speak out in favor of Aaron Swartz like she did when the Chinese blogosphere was censored, perhaps. So the American definition of internet freedom does not extend to access to knowledge, very critical in our country, both from a knowledge perspective and also from the perspective of access to essential medicines. The internet freedom concept also, according to Hillary Clinton, does not include privacy. America, like most other countries, is rolling out comprehensive surveillance technology. In America, the safeguards that are available to European citizens, thanks to the data protection directive, are unavailable. There are some amount of vertical privacy protections, but not as comprehensive as Europe. And Hillary Clinton does not see, in her mind, any contradiction. On the one hand, rolling out comprehensive surveillance, and on the other hand, championing internet freedom. What are the unintended effects of internet censorship? I think most of us in the room will be familiar with the Streisand effect. If you try and censor certain content, then like Barbara Streisand discovered, that content becomes more popular. People go out of the way to share that content, to publish that content, and access the content. So precisely the message that you're trying to shut down gets even more amplified. And in India also, when the government has on various occasions executed block orders inappropriately, they've had precisely that effect. The content that has been blocked has raged across the nation. But perhaps more importantly, another unintended effect of the internet is the effect of capacity building. In America, for years, organizations like the Electronic Frontier Foundation have been asking American netizens to use privacy-protecting technology, like encryption and like virtual private networks. And most of that advocacy completely failed. The average netizen in America did not bother about using privacy-protecting technologies. And then, over the last 10 years, we had a war against consumers, executed mostly by rights holders, the Motion Picture Association of America and the Recording Industry Association of America. Notices were sent to thousands of American youngsters. Some of them were taken to court, still others were arrested. And this action of censorship, if one's definition of internet freedom includes access to knowledge, resulted in young Americans adopting virtual private networks and encryption wholesale. What activists were unable to do for decades was done by the rights holders in America through their acts of censorship within no time. And we saw this also in Bangalore for the first time when the government of India had a legitimate reason to regulate speech during the exodus of northeastern Indians from Bangalore and other cities, when a limit was placed on the daily SMSs that users could send. Users migrated to platforms like WhatsApp and other messaging services that are harder to monitor, harder to censor, harder to control. So there is this unintended effect of censorship, and that is why when the government decides to regulate speech, it must do it as last resort, because usually regulation of speech has the opposite effect. It amplifies the speech that you're trying to keep in check, and it teaches ordinary citizens all sorts of tricks to avoid monitoring and regulation of speech. What is happening in India with only 14 or 15 million broadband connections? Why is the government putting into place draconian law and then implementing draconian law in an arbitrary fashion? Sorry.
1 minute.
Okay, I will tell you the story of Harley Harlow and his monkeys. Harley Harlow is an American psychologist. He put 5 monkeys in a cage and tied a bunch of bananas to the top of the cage. Every time any one of the monkeys tried to reach to the bananas, he would drench all the 5 monkeys in ice-cold water. And then Harley Harlow began to replace the monkeys with monkeys that have never been drenched with ice-cold water. And even when he replaced the monkeys that were drenched would impose the regime of not touching the bananas upon the other monkeys. And soon he had a cage full of monkeys that have never been drenched with ice-cold water, but they all continued to implement the policy of not touching the bananas. So I suspect that our government, through its draconian law and arbitrary implementation, is trying to train us monkeys to become well-behaved citizens. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sunil, for a provocative opening position laid out very well. It's my great pleasure now to invite Professor Timothy Garton Ash from Oxford University, Professor of Modern History and Economic History, Director of the Free Speech Debate, which I would invite people to go and check on the web, and there are 10 principles that they've stated. Professor Ash is an important voice on current issues in the world, and a great delight to read, and it's a special pleasure to invite him to speak at this seminar.
Well, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. It's a huge pleasure to be here at the invitation of the Editors Guild and, of course, Index on Censorship, which I commend to all of you, which has a fantastic track record of fighting for freedom of expression. Like Sunil, I have 3 things to say. Unlike him, none of them are about monkeys. Firstly, I just wanted to answer, being a good professor, I have to give an example to students, answer the question on the exam paper. And the question on the exam paper is freedom of expression under threat in the digital age? To which the answer, in the words of Homer Simpson, is no. Yes, of course, freedom of expression is always under threat, in every time, in every age, digital or otherwise. Is it particularly under threat in the digital age? My answer is no. On the contrary, while all technologies have the potential for good and evil, if you have a very sharp knife, you can use it to cut your meatloaf or to cut someone's throat. The digital and broadly electronic technologies, which connect well over 2 billion people on the internet, and according to the latest figures from the ITU, 85% of the world's population by mobile phone. Think of that, 85 on 100. Just walking the streets of Delhi yesterday, one sees people squatting on the streets with a mobile phone, is an extraordinary opportunity for freedom of expression. It is the biggest opportunity for freedom of expression since Johann Gutenberg popularized printing with movable type. That's a cliche, but I think it's true. Where I think the digital age is actually in itself a real threat is not so much to free speech, it is to privacy. To privacy. How many of you, if I may be a little interactive in this session, how many people in this room are on Facebook? Very good. Well, quite a few. Okay. Do you know that you have been zuckered? Right. The word zuckered, which comes, of course, from Mark Zuckerberg, means to be tricked into sharing more of your private data than you realize by the complexity of the Facebook settings. Okay? And I guess many of us have been zuckered. Now, that is a free speech issue in as much as if I don't have the confidence that what I'm sharing with a couple of friends is going to stay with those couple of friends but may suddenly be shared with the whole world, I will not speak as freely. To that extent it is. But on the whole, my answer is the digital age is a huge plus for freedom of expression. And by the way, if I may say so to our friend from Google, Google is terrifically good on free speech. It's not half so good on privacy, because it's by knowing all about you that it makes its money through targeted advertising. That's number one. Perhaps in that sense, we're the monkeys. Number two, the digital age changes the way we have to think about free speech in the following fashion. In the whole of the modern period, the basic rule of thumb was, when in Rome, do as the Romans do, right? So if you're in the US, you follow the First Amendment. If you're in England, you follow common law. If you're in India, you follow Indian law, and so on. Now, the possibilities of the digital age, regardless of frontiers, do drive a coach and horses through that. This is the background to this project, which was very kindly just mentioned, which, if I can manage this PC, since I'm, as you can see, a totally Mac person, how do I get to the English page? There we are. You see, I'm so totally Mac. There we are. Is the microphone, I think, is the mic still on? You can hear me there. I just have to stick close to it. Is a project in 13 languages, including Hindi and Urdu. Those 13 languages make it linguistically accessible to 80% of fixed internet users, to discuss what should be the norms of free speech in the digital age. And I've just given one reason why we believe that is essential. By the way, for the next 2 weeks, we have India weeks. So half of what you see there, you have War is Not Cricket, which is a piece by an Indian and Pakistani student at Oxford, jointly written about the recent conflict on the line of control, and how the Indian and Pakistani media gave just so totally incompatible accounts of exactly the same event. We have many other features on India. Do please come on the site. Do please comment in any language you choose. Apart from what I've just mentioned, the fact that the rule, when in Rome, do as a Roman do, no longer applies, because when you're in Rome, you're simultaneously in Singapore and New York and Beijing, and also the people of Rome come from everywhere else. So it's a combination of the internet and mass migration. What actually determines your effective freedom of expression is not just the state you're in and its laws. It's at least 3 other things. It's a bunch of international organizations and networks, some of which you've never heard of, like ICANN, which organizes the structure of the internet, or the International Telecommunications Union, the ITU, which is making a power grab to try and control the internet. It's the state you're in. Then thirdly, it's what I call the private powers. if Facebook were a country, it would be the third largest country in the world after India and China. 1 billion users. What Facebook does is much more important than what France does. What Google does is much more important than what Germany does in terms of your effective freedom of expression. So if we just talk about the laws of our particular country, we haven't begun to get at the real issues. And finally, the fourth level, electronically and digitally empowered communities. The Arab Spring, notably in Egypt and Tunisia, was actually made possible, and this is the first people power revolution where this is true, by the electronic media and social media. It did actually organize online. I gather the anti-rape protests, which have made such a huge impression on the whole world in this country, were to at least some degree organized on social media. So self-organizing communities and their standards are the fourth level. So have in mind all those four levels: international organizations, states, private superpowers, and self-empowered, electronically empowered communities. All of those have to set their own standards. Okay, so that's my second point. My third point. I truly believe, and I'm not just saying this because I'm in Delhi, that India is one of the swing states in terms of freedom of expression, along with a few others like Brazil. At one end, you have the United States and Europe with their really quite well-known standards and norms, and there are significant differences, but we know where they are. At the other extreme, you have China, which to the cyber utopian who says, "Comrades, the internet will set you free," answers, "Hang on a minute, not in China." And the biggest and most powerful authoritarian state in the world is taking on the internet. And ladies and gentlemen, it is not yet clear who is winning. It is not yet clear who is winning. The internet of itself does not set you free. There's a battle going on there. Now, it seems to me that India is a huge swing state in this battle. Somewhere between India and the US at that end, Europe and the US at that end, and China at this end, a country which, if I may say so, has the most fantastic practice of free speech, almost free for all in some respects, but also, I mean, it would make some of your popular newspapers make the Sun look like a sedate old spinster, and that's saying something. But also there's a bunch of issues. You mentioned cartoons, India's most famous painter, books like the famous issue with the historian whose book was not republished by OUP, the anti-sedition law, last summer, the blocking of websites, which you wrote about so brilliantly on your website, the treatment of religion, media regulation, a big issue in this country. You know, if you go down the list of hot potatoes for freedom of speech, it is amazing how many of these issues come up in the Indian context. And what I want to say, and this is my last comment, is that it is, I think, wrong, and here I agree with Sunil, to frame it entirely in terms of heroic Google, Facebook, Twitter, internet freedom versus bad, oppressive Indian state. That is much too simplistic. Because, ladies and gentlemen, free speech has never meant unlimited speech, global logorrhea. That it does not mean. There is no liberty without law. Right? So the question is not should we have unlimited speech, it is what are the legitimate limits. And let me give you one quick example. Last summer's blocking of those websites which you wrote about. There is a case to be made that if what is called hate speech is demonstrably dangerous speech, That is to say, you can demonstrate a causal connection between what's up there online and people getting killed and beaten. There is a case for a careful legal blocking of it. And the classic example would be Rwanda, where the connection between hate speech and genocide is demonstrable. But it has to be a clear, transparent, legal and legitimate limit, and not the kind of arbitrary mass blocking that we saw in this case. Similarly with media regulation. One could argue in some ways, our chair may disagree, that some parts of the Indian media perhaps are in some sense too free. Yes? I don't know if you would agree in terms of intrusions of privacy or defamation or the simple publication of lies. It's not the case that that is free speech truly understood. The question is, what kind of media regulation, under what structure, under what law, this is a debate we're having in Britain at the moment, is appropriate, that really defends the freedom of the media and freedom of speech, but not its abuses. And that is why we believe in this project at Oxford that we need a genuinely global debate on these issues that goes across frontiers and is not confined just to one country and to one language. So please come and join us on the website. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for some clear answers which we got from you, Professor Ash. I have great pleasure now in inviting Sunil Gavaskar was the first cricketer to score 10,000 runs in Test cricket, and no matter how many came after him, he was the first. So no matter how many entrepreneurs India will have, Ajit was the first. And he showed the way, and he's written about it in his book, The Wave Rider, which I would strongly recommend you take a look at. It's a very easy read. It's full of little stories, and it's a personal story as well. Apart from all his other achievements, the one thing that most people would not know is that he also supports a football club in his hometown of Kannur in Kerala. Ajit.
Thanks particularly for the plug for my book. I appreciate that. Sound is okay? You know, this... Huh?
You have to get really close.
Yeah, okay, I think this is coming. All right, yeah. You know, this talk of threat to freedom of expression makes me really queasy. I'll tell you the reason why. Because it is discussed in abstract, and none of the real events which have happened in India in recent times which led to this debate are tabled. Let me summarize them in about 2 minutes. What happened? I think sometime in November, a Facebook page, November 2011, a Facebook page appeared. It showed Sonia Gandhi and our Prime Minister. They've been photoshopped in a sexually compromising position. I've seen the picture myself, okay? And another one with the pig on top of a mosque, okay? And this were posted. When this happened, obviously the minister was called, Mrs. Sybil was called by the powers that be and said, hey, this is your territory, you better go do something about it. This is an authentic view from the other side. So the minister calls the Facebook representative, this I'm told, I was not present, and said, look, please do something about this because, quote unquote, my ass is on the line. Okay, that's the way it will be. And you know what the answer was? The answer from the local rep was, that is Facebook of the United States and this is Facebook in India. And if you want to pursue this matter, please go and file a case in a US court and see what you can get. You're saying that to the Union Minister of Communication. So that's what started and aggravated the situation. I was watching it closely from both sides. A few weeks later, Vinay Rai, a journalist, has filed a criminal complaint saying that he was upset by pictures of the Prophet Muhammad. He was, I think, an editor of a Urdu paper, among other things, which has been morphed into something disgusting. I've seen that too. Another one of the goddess Saraswati, which has been morphed. So there again, the criminal case is now in a court in Delhi. As of last, I think summons have been issued to the US chiefs of all these companies, and the matter is escalating. Sometime in April, it will now come to the public forum. Okay, that was one set when both sides have agreed to have a pitched battle. What was the second one? When the intermediary guidelines were issued, somewhere, I think there was an issue of when somebody protests against any content on an intermediary, whether it should be taken down in 36 hours or some action is taken within 36 hours. There's a debate. How does this happen? I think many others, including my good friend Sunil's organization, said this was crazy. What is it? The chilling effect on free expression of these internet rules. That's very evocatively named. But what was really the issue? The issue was, as I'll tell you later, the issue is that it was just poor drafting of the rules. What was intended is that within 36 hours, you must say something to the person who complains. But if you ever spend time with the lower levels of the bureaucracy in Delhi, as I often do, they're very English challenged. If you get them to write rules, it appears as something else. You ask them, "Is this what you mean?" They say, "Yes, sir." And these rules are normally negotiated by bureaucrats. And they think, it's apparent to me what is the problem. I said, that is not how the rest of India is viewing it. Please see. Second case. The third is on my own town of Bombay. Two young women, Shaheen and Reenu, were arrested because one made a Facebook post criticizing the call for a band, a shutdown, a band. That was, I think, Shaheen made the post, and a friend went and did a Facebook like on it. It was on Facebook. So this obviously aggravated people, because I can tell you, many people, millions in Bombay, were totally aggrieved when Bal Thackeray died. I may not understand, but I never grew up in Bombay. I arrived there at the age of 20. But people they felt as some major loss to themselves have happened. And when this happened, local people rushed to a police station and demanded arrest. Now, that station house officer himself, who perhaps reveres Bal Thackeray, went and did the arrest. So these are the events. Now, what did he arrest him under? They were not arrested under the IT Act. It is often assumed that the draconian IT Act is what in that. They were arrested under Section 5052 and Section 295 of the Indian Penal Code, which was written in the 1830s by Macaulay. It is not a creation of the current government. Okay. So these are, get the facts are down on the same common page. Underlying all this, what are the big issues? There must be some big issues for, when people fight and dogs bark, there are some bigger issues. It's not just dogs hate each other. Huh? First is what? The nation state, that late 19th century creation where the geographic boundaries were sacrosanct, and you create a law, it will be obeyed by everybody in their geography. That's a mid-late 19th century creation. And all offences as defined by that nation state will be applied to all people within that. Leaders of nation states are scratching their head and say, what is this? Somebody outside in some other country is doing things and we are unable to do. There is a sense of powerlessness among decision makers within the nation state. So the legal system does not know how to deal with these new animals like all of us. If Facebook has problems in India, actually we run things in the United States where also we get FBI requests and all kinds of things all the time. We have 2, 3, 4 million users in the United States. All the time, the week does not pass before one request from the FBI. So all parties concerned. And we also say, but we are an Indian company, please come and file a case here. We do that routinely. Okay? So the nation state is challenged. We must find a solution to it. I don't know the answers, but we must think and rationally figure out how does the nation state deal with this issue. The second issue is the information intermediary. I'm the guy who wrote that section in the Information Technology Act. I won't tell you. I was a member of the committee, and most of them were not interested, so I sat and wrote the whole thing. The information intermediary is a new entity which is different from a distributor, a dealer, and many others. The information intermediary is the key tool which creates productivity in the information age. It's the exact equivalent of a factory in the industrial era. Now, that has to be protected. It has not been explained to most people why an information intermediary needs to be protected to extract all the productivity gains of the information age. That's not been explained by anybody. Not even for 95% of people in this room, I promise you. You need to protect information intermediaries, otherwise productivity can't be extracted in the new system. The concept is not fully understood, certainly not understood by small town magistrates. I've interviewed quite a few. They are blank. Nobody's explained it to them. Generally speaking, when a new piece of legislation comes to India, it takes about 25 years for that to be fully understood the whole country at large. The people are very comfortable with the Indian Penal Code because it was enacted in 1857 or 58, soon after the mutiny. So it's 110 years of practice, so all policemen understand what it is. This, nobody understands. These are very important issues. I'm not joking, but this is the reality of laws implemented. The third is phrasing challenges. This 36 hours versus acting, I promise you, it is totally just bad English. There is no motive behind it. I was there when it was being phrased. I kept telling them, look, guys, this is not English. It's some other language, maybe Hindi or Punjabi, something of that kind. So phrasing is a challenge, and one should not impute too much motives, but that phrasing must be corrected. That's about all there is to it. There's no other greater Machiavellian plan to dominate and so on. The Bombay case, what was the real issue in the Bombay case? The Bombay case was, in framing these rules, power was delegated to the station house officer, which is the head of the police station. That was a tragic mistake. That should never be done in any new law, because the new law takes 25 years for him to understand. So this was a mistake. So I think this is the issue. Now, finally, I just wanted to tell you that while everything looks different and the internet looks democratic, just 8 to 9 million people do practically all the postings in India. Do you know that? And everyone else just watches. This is true for all internet social type media in every country. This is true for Facebook in the United States, Twitter. In Twitter, I think roughly 7 to 8% do the postings, others follow. Okay? So it's not as democratic as it looks. In Wikipedia, 2.5 people post, 98% watch. I was recounting, I know it's favorite in these kind of meetings to knock China, but a friend of mine went and married Hu Jintao's daughter, so we keep talking all the time. And I asked him, yeah, what do you do in China? You think about these problems? He said, yeah. But he said, Ajit, you look at India playing cricket, 22 people play and 200 million people watch. So what's different?
Thank you, Ajit. Let me do a small plug at this moment for Business Standard, and then Ajit's also a columnist with us. I now turn to Kirsty Hughes, our guest and partner from London. We've already had an introduction, so I don't need to add anything more except to say we're very happy to have you here.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed, and it's great to be here. I want to start where both Tim and Ajit got to at some points in their presentations as well, and that is to touch on this question of borders, because if we start one step before that and remind ourselves that freedom of expression is a universal right, it's not a US and European right, and it's not a Indian right, it's a universal right, and it's a fundamental right. And if we think about what that says in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, I'm not going to quote you it exactly, but it's about the freedom to send, receive, impart, exchange information and ideas by any media and regardless of frontiers. So I think that has always been there as an issue and a challenge, and of course that means that Tim is right, that in many ways the digital age should be this great boon and boost for freedom of expression. And so freedom of expression has never been a universal right within one country, that I should sit there back home in the UK and have freedom of speech there, and you should sit here in India and have freedom of speech here, but we shouldn't have it between us, whether by books or phone or now the digital age. So I think universality of that universal right is always been really important, but certainly it's got much more challenged as a result of the swiftness and the reach of the digital age. So I think by posing this question to this panel, it's not to be alarmist. We've got huge amounts of information and free expression and access to free expression that people in many ways didn't have before, even to some extent in countries like China. But I would say perhaps more clearly or more firmly than some on this panel, and maybe one of the areas where we disagree, I think there are some very worrying and quite disturbing trends. I think we see an increasing number of governments moving to control the internet in a range of ways, and these aren't only the authoritarian governments. There are governments in democracies, whether India or whether the UK. And I think there are three risks, really. We risk moving towards a much more controlled net. I think we risk moving towards a partially censored net. And I think as part of that, we then risk moving to a fragmented net. And the World Wide Web works and gives us what it gives us by being international, by not being fragmented. So I think in many ways these borders, whether geographical or virtual, are very, very important. So I'm going to be extremely boring and do what I think all my predecessors on this panel have done and claim at least that I'm going to make 3 points. When I worked in Brussels, everybody always said that it was the French who always made 3 points, and that was what they were taught at school, and if they really had 9, they divided each of the 3 into sub-3s, but I promise I promise not to do that. So what I want to talk about very briefly is, first of all, to make some remarks about state censorship online in the world today. I want to talk a little bit about corporate censorship and the privatization of censorship, and I will touch very briefly, if I have time, on issues around surveillance and mass surveillance of people online today. I think if we talk about state censorship, I think the very phrase conjures up the authoritarian countries, doesn't it? It makes us think about China or Iran, who's trying to build its own internet just within Iran, completely sealed off from the rest of the world. Or it may conjure up Russia with its new laws that are allowing it to blacklist and block a whole new set of websites. Or it can conjure up, and another interesting example for this debate, it can conjure up a country like Azerbaijan, which if I don't know if we have any government representatives from Azerbaijan with us today, but if they were here, I can tell you they would be saying what a free internet they have in that country. And in many ways that is true. And in other ways it's not true, because you don't have the sort of surveillance Great China Firewall in Azerbaijan, but bloggers in that country are censored and repressed by very old-fashioned and traditional methods. They're harassed offline. They're imprisoned for hooliganism. They're videoed and blackmailed offline. So let's not think offline and online are somehow two separate worlds. The politics and the laws cut across them. But I think what should really be our focus tonight is censorship in democracies. And of course, censorship in democracies is actually in many ways very easy, because if you go back to that Universal Declaration of Human Rights that I mentioned at the start, it's a fundamental right, our free speech, but it's not an absolute right. And what that means, if you're an international lawyer, which I'm not, or if you're a politician, is that there are reasons or excuses such as national security, public order, public morals, however you define those, and other issues, which might mean you can, to a necessary and proportionate extent, constrain free speech. Well, that's all the legroom and more that any government needs, isn't it? So whether it's the British government or the Indian government issuing takedown requests, blocking websites, launching prosecutions, they can still claim that they are the exemplars. And this is where I would have to say I do disagree with Tim, who said we have the US and Europe there, that we have India and Brazil in the middle as the swing states, and China and Russia over there. I think I would want to put my country forward as a swing state, if a swing state is a country that's half good and half bad. It's been very interesting for me in the last few days in Delhi to hear of some of these examples of the sorts of prosecutions and cases you've had here, and those that are seen as absolutely unacceptable by kind of liberal opinion, if you like, and those that are more debatable. I think what we've seen in the last year or two in the UK, and I don't have time to go into great detail, but we've seen a really worrying trend in terms of criminalisation of speech, especially on social media. And if I just give you a couple of examples, there was a young student was arrested in November. What was his crime? He'd put a photo onto Facebook of burning one of the red poppies that some people in the UK, a lot of people, but not me, choose to wear in November as a war memory of the war dead in the UK. Well, yes, sensitive topic, but it's certainly in the UK that I think I grew up in. There were always debates about wars. There were always people in favour or against, whether it was the Iraq War or the Falklands War or even the Second World War. But he was arrested, and It's interesting to hear people here talk about Section 66A, if I've got that right. In the UK, it's the Comms Act 2003, Article 123, and that bans grossly offensive language, and it criminalises grossly offensive language. But it was actually developed not in 2003, but it came back from the 1930s. And what's happening in the UK is a law that was developed to stop harassment of public telephone operators is now being used to drag teenagers from their beds and arrest them because they've put photos of a burning poppy onto Facebook. Or I can give you slightly more, what would be more offensive examples for some. One man was given a community service punishment order because he'd put a Facebook post up that said British soldiers in Afghanistan should burn in hell. Well, it's a bit graphic. It's certainly both against the war in Afghanistan and it's against British soldiers, but can we not tolerate that sort of free speech in Britain anymore? Or are we getting more sensitive because of things being online? Or are we more sensitive, we somehow start to feel we should never be offended? So I think these are all issues that challenge all of us. There has been a big debate about this, by the way, in the UK, and if you're interested in this, our Director of Public Prosecutions issued some interim guidelines a month ago to try and stop what could become a massive trend in police launching prosecutions for a whole range of offensive remarks on Twitter or Facebook or anywhere else in the blogosphere and on the web. Let me just say a couple of things then on my second topic. I may never get to my third one, but especially since we've got various representatives of the private sector and web host companies here. I think there's two sides to the privatization of censorship that worry me when we look at the digital age today. One is that governments are starting to co-opt those private companies, and to some extent the private companies are standing up to that, and that's very welcome. They're saying, you should do the monitoring, you should do the filtering, you should do the takedown, and it comes back to what was just being said about intermediary liability and trying to get people to understand why that's such a critical issue. So I think there's one set of issues there around privatization of censorship, but there's the other side which has also been mentioned already, and that's the fact that Facebook has its 1 billion members, and for its 1 billion members it's saying what speech and what photos and what visual speech or visual expression is acceptable and is not acceptable. And that's the role that governments used to play to the extent they could within their borders, and suddenly we're finding big companies are doing this. Now, I think the answer that I've heard on this is, well, but, if you're an editor of a newspaper, you choose what's on your letters pages, what's on your newspapers. If you curate a meeting like this, you choose how you run it, what's an acceptable question from the audience. This is just private use of editorial and other judgments. But once you're talking about 1 billion people, this third biggest country in the world, then I think we're talking about a different order of magnitude. And Facebook has various rules about nudity in the photos on Facebook, which has led to a debate about what about breastfeeding mothers, for instance. It has a whole set of rules. So I think it's another angle in on some of these challenges to all of us around digital freedom of expression. Let me just conclude with a couple of comments about surveillance. And again, I don't only want to talk about the UK, but perhaps I just, while I'm making my case, it's also a swing state. We've only just, courtesy of a very tough scrutiny committee of MPs in the UK, just pushed back on a bill that was labelled by the media and others as Snooper's Charter in the UK, which would have created the widest, most far-reaching mass surveillance of a population in a democracy today in terms of gathering pretty much all the digital communication information you could on a population. So, and it's very interesting to see William Hague, the Foreign Secretary, go around the world and talk about the importance of digital freedom, just doubtless in train with Hillary Clinton, but the Home Ministry back in the UK going for that sort of surveillance. So it's maybe classic and typical that you get foreign offices and home offices at each other's throats, but I think, as a number of other speakers have said, the issue of surveillance, privacy, and the potential chilling effects of that are another really important element if we're trying to identify what are the things we should be most worried about. I don't have time to go into it, but as Tim said, that's not to say the web should be an anarchy. That's not to say we don't live in societies that have a rule of law, but that is to say we have to look very carefully at what's going on the internet, where our principles and laws go across, where the technology may create a new issue, like this question of what's an intermediary, are there a publisher, are there a service provider, whose roles are what. But let's not go for knee-jerk reactions just because something that may have been offensive, if it was in a newspaper, is offensive but more widely disseminated on Twitter or Facebook or somewhere else. Or we'll soon find if we try and stop with a global top-down agreement that we're all going to have no offensive speech around the world, which of course Russia and China would sign up to, and that's what they were playing at the ITU, we'll find we've shrunk our space for free speech to pretty much nothing at all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and we now come to our last panelist, Raman Chima from Google India. And Mr. Chima, you've had some challenges, I think, tossed across to you. And the question is whether large corporations are hiding behind free speech to protect their own interests.
Thank you so much. I also have the challenge that Kirsty has already made the joke about people doing 3 points. So my 3 points are going to sound ridiculous at the beginning of it. Thank you so much. It's firstly lovely to be here, and I'm happy to be able to respond to what people have brought up, but also to put some ideas forward for the Q&A, which will open up right now. And the first thing I wanted to talk about was to just give you a sense of what I want to talk about right now. And that's about 3 things. One is, as many people on the panel pointed out, it's not about absolute freedom. It's not about no regulation, but obviously it is about what's appropriate and lawful. As a person involved in technology policy, but more importantly as a lawyer, brought up in the tradition of India's commitment to democracy and constitutionalism, we all recognize that you have restrictions and they can be imposed. But the point, of course, and that's why lawyers make their money, unfortunately, is you find out is whether those restrictions are lawful or constitutional. The other point, of course, that technologists sometimes point out in this regard is whether regulations sometimes are appropriate, and that's something of a policy question. It's also a technical question. For example, you might want to do something, but literally sometimes, for example, architecture will not allow you to build a 20-story building on marshland, for example. That's a great example. Engineers sometimes point out when politicians or regulators can't give them great solutions saying do this, they say, well, we can't because it's just not technologically not possible to do. Or you could do it, but you make a decision that you want to curb the ability of a product to work rather than reach its true potential. There are 2 other things that I also wanted to mention, and again, the panel mentioned this previously, that the debate is global. It's not just about one country, it's not just painting villains versus heroes. It's about the fact that in many countries across the world, particularly democracies, and I do admit a bias there, I personally am more interested in what democracies do on this, because that is where debate takes place. And also being a person who's been brought up in one, I've been interested in what takes place here, also with our fellow countries in other regions, as to what's taking place. These debates are global, and that's something the panel pointed out, and I'm going to give you a bit more of context there. And lastly, and this is what I want to start with, is my personal sense of optimism about this, and to realize what we're really looking at. And let me give you an anecdote about this first. Some of you might be familiar, around a couple of years ago, there were bomb attacks that took place in Bombay, and people were trying to respond to it. During that time, it was quite difficult for residents in Bombay. I had friends as well there, and they were trying to find out where can they go, what forms of commuter transit were available, where could they go, for example, if they wanted to donate blood. They were friends of theirs they couldn't find, they were trying to locate them. And the interesting thing is that in many cases around the world when this takes place, you have emergency responder services who try to do things. Now, as you know, of course, that we in our country, we're trying to put in place many of these mechanisms. But what's interesting is the story of what I call as the Google document behind this. So I just noticed this online on Twitter, of all things, that somebody set up a link saying, oh, if you're trying to find your friends in Bombay, perhaps we should just put all of the names in one Google document, a document that you can put up online and that anyone can edit, and put across your missing friends' names there. Let's try to find them. Somebody did that, then they said, okay, my friends are stranded. How can they go from X location to Y location in Bombay? People started adding on their own, as they saw this trend on Twitter, they started adding locations of taxi services that were still running, commuter train services that were still available, and other transit information. And as I saw it in 2 hours, it went from just a document about missing friends to transit information about blood banks, information about true information from the police helpline numbers, and other things like that. And this is all possible. And just imagine it, this wasn't the case not just, I'm talking about 10 or 20 years ago, but even 5 years ago. You couldn't have a situation where somebody could just start with one simple document, put it up online. Anyone could access it, anyone could collaborate with it, and instantaneously publish information and could work. For example, frankly, as a person who works for Google, I was more worried that our systems wouldn't be able to take it and it would crash. Luckily, it didn't. But that's an example of what the net makes possible today. The ability to instantly publish, collaborate, and to truly be able to put across information at practically zero cost. And that's the sense what I wanted to give you at. And it's not just about the ability to help people in emergency situations. The internet is one of the most important elements of national economies today. So I remember reading in December, the McKinsey Global Institute brought out interesting research about the fact that in India, for example, the internet now contributes over 1.6% to India's GDP. It's larger than many traditional established industries in India. And that's without taking into account the fact that the internet acts as a multiplier to many existing industries. So that's a sense of where we're going from. But let me go back to the other 2 points that I mentioned. One about absolute freedoms, and about the fact that what we're talking about here is a debate about lawful and appropriate regulation, which is an example that Mr. Balakrishnan also brought out quite clearly, and also about the fact of the debate being global. Now, an example I'd like to give you is the fact that, and this is the interesting thing, that these debates have been happening for now nearly 2 decades. In 1996, this debate took place in the US, the bastion as such of where the internet grew up, the first place also where many of these debates took place due to that fact. So in 1996, the Clinton administration decided that it was concerned by content online. Rather, not even the administration, but legislators in the US House of Congress found it to be something they were concerned about. They said it's something new, there's content available online which we believe we may have problems with, families might be affected. So they went ahead and passed something called the Communications Decency Act, which said that in the US, the federal government would be given extraordinary powers to go ahead and put restrictions regarding decency. And then there are 2 stories about this that I wanted to give you. The first is the fact that the US Supreme Court, even back in 96, 98, and a Supreme Court with judges who tend to be conservative, who tend to have, and at that point of time, never probably used the web, they went ahead and declared this to be unconstitutional. And the reason they gave for it was very interesting. They said that the internet deserves free speech protection. And that's something that many of us might be sympathetic to right now. But they gave something even more interesting. They said the internet deserves free speech protection, like any medium of communication, but it deserves incredibly powerful free speech protection because it is unparalleled in its ability to work, in the sense and how it makes expression possible and how it allows people to collaborate and to network across borders at practically zero cost. They said any regulation that applies through the net, therefore, must be appropriate for its engineering. So they said not that there should be no regulation, but regulation should be appropriate for what takes place there. So for example, pre-licensing content, saying that you have to have your content rated before you could put it up on the web, would be a bit problematic, at least in the context of the US. But as I mentioned, there are 2 stories about this act. They found it unconstitutional, yes, but they left one part of it there. And that was a section called Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, introduced at the last minute, thanks to the way the US Congress works, by a legislator who was concerned about the fact that the platforms at that point of time, the information engines, as Mr. Balakrishnan called them, were being targeted by people. People were saying that I don't want this content to be there on the web, even though you may not have posted it, your users may have posted it. I want to sue you for content. And these are the services that were really powering the web at that point of time. Barely heard of, but it was there. That was saved. The US Supreme Court said, leave it there. And in fact, that section now is regarded as one of the most important benchmarks for internet law in the world. It's the fact that you don't hold platforms responsible for what they make available unless they had a direct role in it, unless they played an editorial role in it. And what's interesting is this is where I point out, and going back to what Mr. Abraham said at the beginning, it's not about just letting go of the net. For example, this was an active legal measure. It was law to enable the internet. In many countries, for example, you have law that protects aggressively the right of journalists not to be targeted for violence, the fact that newspapers should be free and open, and that sort of legal intervention was also done here. So it's not about letting go of the net. It's about having law that really protects democratic values and advances the fundamental freedoms that all of us truly hold dear. And going beyond that, as I mentioned, this is not just a debate that's happening in India or the US or some countries. It's a global debate. But the important thing is to recognize that globally, we now agree to certain standards. So for example, last year, and even before that in 2011, the UN Special Rapporteur on Free Expression, a gentleman by the name of Frank William LaRue, a lawyer famous for protecting human rights across South America, began a process at the request of the United Nations to point out how should governments across the world look at matters concerning internet speech. And what Frank LaRue eventually came out with was a report that said governments have a lawful need to sometimes put in place regulation, but the regulation should be very carefully done and only under certain conditions permitted by instruments such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Instruments which, by the way, for example, India truly cherishes, and our Supreme Court has strengthened and repeatedly cited. What's more interesting is that this was in fact passed by the UN Human Rights Council, a wide, diverse body of governments from across the world, not just Western governments, not just Southern governments, but countries across the world, where the UN Human Rights Council endorsed his recommendations and said the internet deserves protection in many ways. This is an important value which we must further. And for example, I was proud to say that as an Indian, that India voted in favor of that resolution as well. But what I wanted to go to then was the fact that these debates have been happening in many places. And it's been happening because the internet's even more important to our daily lives. For example, recently, in the European Court of Human Rights in the European Union, it was found that when Turkey, for example, blocked entire sites, not just specific content, but then they blocked entire sites because they wanted to take punitive action, that violated the European Declaration of Human Rights and violated international human rights standards. And what's interesting, again, going back to the economic point that I pointed out, is that the judges of the European Court of Human Rights pointed out not just was it a threat and a violation of the European Declaration of Human Rights, but it was also the fact that it had an enormous negative economic impact as well. It affected livelihoods. So it's not just about the right to free speech and expression, but it's about the fact of the right to livelihood to people who are now making use of the internet as the fundamental way of communication and the fundamental way of doing business. For example, most newspapers now in India have a website. Most journalists, for example, in India will first find out about a story due to Twitter, due to an email update they received. It's something that's truly revolutionary. We sometimes don't appreciate the simple power of email. We didn't have email back in 95 and 96. I remember when people were logging in, even at that point of time, I admit to being fairly young at that age, but people logging in via textual interfaces called shell accounts and seeing very crude information coming out there. Whereas today, for example, somebody can take a picture on a mobile phone and instantaneously publish it saying this is taking place. And what's interesting is that the European Court of Human Rights then went to say that, look, people may abuse this power, then you specifically block content in certain cases under acceptable process, but you don't block entire means of communication. And that's something they pointed out there. They also pointed it out because they said these information engines, these platforms that now make the internet really incredibly capable, the various services used, not just Facebook, Twitter, but the next range of services that many of you might be using, because on the net, what is active today may not be active even a year from now. It was recognized the fact that it's an important contributor to national economies again. So for example, I talked to you a bit earlier about the economic impact the internet is having in India. What is interesting is just to again go back to something that Mr. Balakrishnan brought out as an important fact. Information engines have been recognized as being an important contributor to the economy of Europe. That's something that was pointed out in a study, and if I remember correctly, it pointed out that approximately 310 billion euros now, so nearly that's around 1.4% of Europe's GDP, is because of these information engines and what they make possible there. And that's just by 2009 figures. So what we must recognize is the fact is the internet is a core element of our democracies. It's a core element of our national economies. And what's important here is to keep in mind that it's not just about no regulation. It's about what is appropriate, what is lawful, what we want, and then recognizing that these debates are taking place globally. So it's important, especially in our various countries, to stand up for what we want in whatever format and to engage in these debates. And the last thing I'll just leave is a plug, because many people have been plugging things they've been talking about. So I'll just talk about my own one, rather my company's one. So we have something called the Google Transparency Report, where we try to give information about how governments make requests globally. So you can see it's a global conversation. It's not just one or two countries. Governments across the world ask for it. But again, they ask for it under different reasons. And what we always try and do is work with governments across the world when we lawfully can, to respond to requests that are lawful, that are legitimate, and in cases if we are not able to, then to be able to engage in dialogue with national governments. But it's not just about responding to a takedown request or to a user data request. What's really important for all of us is to engage in the policy dialogue as to what legal framework, what sort of societal framework do we want regarding speech on the internet. And with that, I'll end.
Thank you, Mr. Chima. We've had a rich feast of issues and ideas thrown up. Unfortunately, we've also overshot our time limit a bit, so we will have only about 12 or 15 minutes to get this discussed openly from the floor. All those who want to ask a question, I would request, I think there are mics around. Yeah, so the lady here in front, I would just request you to please identify yourself and to say which panelist you would like a response from. And 3 hands have gone up that I can see, so we'll take 3 first and then we'll come to the panel and then we'll try and see if we can take some more. And there's one there and one here. So we'll come to you in the second round. Okay, shoot.
Hi, my name is Subhi Chaturvedi and I teach journalism and communication at Delhi University. I work with new media. That's really my primary area of intervention, and free speech and expression in the capacity of an independent documentary filmmaker. So the other professor in the room. I have 2 threads to my question and I'll keep it really brief. One of them is for Sunil and the other one is for Ajit. I find myself at this awkward position at having to take a position which might reflect an accordance with large evil corporates, so to speak, or about 2% of the people who are on the other side of the digital enabled age, so to speak. So one of the things that professors do is they read, I see 3 key propositions: freedom of expression, threat, and digital age. I think every proposition needs markers, and I was hoping there'd be more debate. Kirsty hinted at that, and I believe Sebastian also took on those points. My first question is to Sunil. When you talk about large American corporations and the debates around freedom of speech and expression, those are exactly the kind of arguments that we heard when we were trying to get a reasoned response from the Indian government that this is all part of US propaganda. We get a little worrisome as civil society and academia, because when civil society begins to sound...
question?
Yeah, that's my question really to him. When they begin to sound like the government, that's something that we worry about. The other response that I'd like from Ajit, civil society also gets a little more worried when government gets portrayed as bumbling, nice, warm, huggable teddy bears. I think they also have a lot of very smart people who do understand when they're writing laws that this is the kind of impact that they will have. There have been enhanced cooperation groups. There have been attempts to hand over on a platter the internet to a certain UN body, and we've been very worried because we don't even have access to those documents online. So if you could take those 2 questions and responses. The idea that government is engaging, and the idea that this is how laws are being formed with engagement with multi-stakeholder groups, and they're not really nice, well-meaning people, because we've been dealing with them on an everyday basis because they have really smart people like you working for them.
Gentleman at the back. You, I think you raised your hand. Yes.
Thank you very much. My name is William Crawley. I'm visiting from London, former BBC editor, now at the University of London. My question is really for Sunil and perhaps for other members of the panel. There are some areas of the internet, and I'm thinking of Wikipedia, in which technical solutions have been used to try and provide a choice for people who want access to certain kinds of material or don't want access to certain kinds of material. I mean, it's used in the, as I understand it, the English Wikipedia to separate those who demanded that there should be no representations of the Prophet Muhammad on the internet, and others who say, well, this is a perfectly legitimate history of representation in the Islamic world, apart from anything else. So my question is, how far can technical solutions, making things accessible or not accessible, contribute to protecting people's rights and without violating freedom of expression?
And the third question, yes.
I'd like to pose a question to Professor Ash. My name is Zia Haq. I'm from the Hindustan Times. One of the trickiest areas of free speech has to do with free speech and religion. Most hate speeches, whatever their definition, have to do with religion. It's a common occurrence everywhere, including in India. Now, should free speech include hate speech, even when it's not demonstrably dangerous, as you argued? Is that okay? I mean, where do we draw the line? Is there a distinction between free speech and bad speech and hate speech?
Okay,
Thank
that's
you.
a clear question. Let's start with Sunil and then we'll move left. No, you can do it from here if you can get a mic.
So sorry, does this work? So the gold standard when it comes to internet governance, according to the liberal perspective at least, is multi-stakeholder governance, where all stakeholders come to the table and contribute a point of view. If civil society has exactly the same point of view as the corporate sector, then that stakeholder is completely redundant. I watched Ambassador Kramer's debrief to US civil society, ISOC, Internet Society, and Public Knowledge were in the room. And both those organizations didn't disagree with Kramer on any wicket-related issue. So basically, civil society has made itself redundant because it has no disagreement at all with large corporations. This can't be the case. At least on data protection, we completely disagree with the position, for example, that some of the large intermediaries have. We don't see large intermediaries go across the world saying we need strong data protection law. We don't see them champion privacy protection as much as they champion free speech protection. So as long as civil society can make its minds up independently, then it will necessarily be the case that we will disagree. Because our research has demonstrated that they don't go beyond self-interest when it comes to protecting free speech. Okay. Our sting operation has demonstrated this.
Perfect. Kirsty, do you have something to say?
Maybe just a very brief remark on the last question, because I think it touches on many of the most complex issues you can face around free speech. There's also a right to freedom of religious belief, including not to have any belief, and you put that together with freedom of expression, and that means we should be able to discuss and debate religion freely. Where you draw the line from speech that is threatening and violent to speech that is hateful, to speech that is grossly offensive, to speech that is offensive, is where it can start getting very subjective, and where people draw the line in different places, and where societies also draw the line in different places. In the UK, we have a law against insulting, abusive, or threatening racial hatred speech, but only threatening religiously hatred speech. So I mean, I won't say more than that now, but I think there are risks of drawing the line in a place where actually we're then just saying nobody must be offended, but that doesn't mean society shouldn't look at hateful and threatening speech.
You know, Professor Chaturvedi, you know, I did not deliberately paint a well-meaning, bumbling look for government. I was presenting an ethnographic view of how government decisions are made, and that's very important. Either you can live your life opposing government, or alternatively you can go fix the problems. For example, I pointed out 3 specific problems. If the station house officer, if you empower him too much in a new legislation, you meet tragedy. You have to fix that. You have to fix it. The second piece was drafting problems in rules. It's a reality. I mean, if you spend any time on it, we have to find a way to solve that piece so that misunderstandings don't happen in society. And the third part, which I did not mention, lack of time, India's legal system is excessively criminalized. For example, an offensive communication being sent to somebody, the bureaucrats have inserted something saying you will get up to 3 years of imprisonment. That's crazy. In most other countries, it will be a civil offense. Somebody who is damaged, we pay a fine and get on with it. So we have to fix these parts of our system. Otherwise, you can cry till you're blue in the face, and the system will not change. I can't accept such a life,
Thank you for a really excellent question from the Hindustan Times. Let me just very quickly say to Kirsty, so I'm not misunderstood, that when I say swing state, I don't mean half good, half bad. What we say in England, the curate's egg, because England is certainly a curate's egg. There's a lot that's bad in the egg. But what I mean by a swing state is a very big country whose position is unclear and which is such an IT superpower and has so many people online and is going to play such an important role in the world that its position will actually swing the whole global debate. And that, in that sense, Britain is not a swing state and India is. Now, to your question, I would say 3 things that have actually emerged from the sort of process of the debate we've had so far. Number 1, you have to distinguish between norms or principles which should be applied always, everywhere, in all circumstances, And one of those is the principle we formulate as follows. We neither make threats of violence nor accept violent intimidation. There are two sides to it, not just one. We neither make threats of violence nor accept violent intimidation. I would not criminalize hate speech, as many European countries do. In itself, I criminalize dangerous speech when it clearly leads to violence. That's point number one. Point number two, you asked about religion. We have a principle on there which goes to religion. It says, we respect the believer, but not necessarily the content of the belief. Classic liberal principle. I presented this project to a group of Indian MPs from across the board, and they all got up in arms. They wouldn't let me finish. And they all started talking at once, and they said, you can't do that in India. It's absolutely impossible. It simply wouldn't work. The whole country would fall apart and so on. Well, okay, if that genuinely is a democratically arrived at and legally implemented consensus in this country, who am I to say it should be otherwise? So I think to me that is a principle of a different order. I would want to argue to you that in the long term you would be better off if you accepted the principle that you can respect the believer while questioning the content of his or her belief. But in the meantime, I totally respect the right of India as the world's largest democracy to implement that principle, which of course it does very inconsistently, but that's another question. Final point, and this goes to the very interesting comment of Ajit Balakrishnan. What you can't expect to do is to have 100% implementation. Because the only way you can do that is by having the Great Firewall of India, the Great Firewall of Australia, the Great Firewall of France, the Great Firewall of Germany, the Great Firewall of Switzerland, by having intrusive internet blocking and filtering. So I think even if you do that, you've got to accept there's going to be a certain permeability and leakage across frontiers, and just live with it.
Okay, I'm afraid we actually are out of time, but I will take those two questions, one from there and then over here. Okay, one more here. And then that's it. I'm sorry, I'll have to close.
Keep the questions short. First question is for Sunil. Some very interesting, my name is Vipul Mudgal. I work for a research institute called CSDS. Some very interesting democratic expressions have emerged out of internet, and one of them is open source movement and the other is WikiLeaks. Now, where do you see them going? That's the first question. Second question is
What's the second? I'm sorry.
Where do you see them going?
Where do you see them going?
What is open source and the other one?
Is WikiLeaks.
WikiLeaks.
Yeah. And my second question is to you, Mr. Balakrishnan. Is it possible, we know that the governments are known to make a mess of things, particularly regulations. We've seen in case of 2G scam in India. Now, is it possible to have some kind of a citizens regulation in which you have real citizens, not the nephews of ministers, like artists, architects, poets, housewives, and people? Yeah.
Virat here.
I just want to make two brief interventions, correct the positions that were taken by the speakers, and then a question. First, to Sunil's point, I think the industry actually does work really hard on private protection. I just want to tell you that we fight every day with the government to increase. The industry as a whole, the telecom industry as a whole, fights every day with the government to increase the encryption levels, which is right now set at 40, beyond which you have to hand over keys. We argue every single day to increase that to 128 and higher, which is also the prescribed standard by RBI. So just want to assure you that we are on the right side of that discussion. Just a factual point. The second point to Mr. Balakrishnan, I think the report from the room is exaggerated. The minister didn't say as harshly as you presented, and I don't think the pictures were as sexually explicit as have been mentioned. There were some, hugs and kisses, but it wasn't sexually explicit stuff. I've given about 3 hugs here, so we have produced some adult content since I've come into the room. So I just want to be factually incorrect about how it is reported.
You haven't seen the picture?
I have, sir. I have it here. We just Googled it online. That's the great thing about digital age. But I don't want to get into an argument. I just want to say it's an extreme position, and that's how it gets misreported. And I just want to be careful about both sides. The Honorable Minister didn't go to that extreme, and the industry didn't tell him go to the US. They didn't say that. They said, please follow the law, and here is the law. So there are people in the room who were in that room. I just don't want to, it's sub judice, so we don't want to get into that.
Identify yourself.
Virat Bhatia.
Representing?
Vicky. And AT&T.
AT&T.
Yeah.
That's the answer.
Yeah. Sorry?
That's the answer. That's it.
Okay. It's a low even for you. Let me just, the question that I had was, that I have, Ninan, is that to the point that you have today, which is the fact that is freedom of expression under threat in the digital age, the fact is that
No, I think you should now ask a question.
That's the question. That's the question. Would you, would the panel agree that with 6 billion mobile phones, not just internet, but voice communication being enhanced dramatically since the mid-90s, that the freedom of expression has increased dramatically by now than reduced, minus only the internet content?
Okay, last one, and I would request you really to be very brief.
My name is Harsh, and I've got two questions. Everybody talked about developing international norms and international debates, but I want to ask that the socio-political and economic systems of all these countries are so diverse, and the freedom of expression strikes at the root of these economic, social and political system. So how do we develop common international norms regarding this? And even if we develop, I think there will be some arm twisting by the powerful countries.
Okay.
And the second question is to Ramanjit. I know that corporate houses want to increase their revenue, their profit. So they develop new things like i4, i4s, i5, and they say that we are very innovative and very creative. But when curbing these things are concerned, like curbing the freedom of these things, then they say that it is not technologically feasible that we can curb these things. So I find very inconsistency in this, where does that innovativeness and creativeness goes at that time?
Okay, in the interest of brevity, Sunil, Ajit, and then Raman.
I'd like to begin by thanking Virat for all the hard work he's doing promoting the right of privacy, but there is much more that has to be done beyond the ban on encryption and key escrow. On the question of open source and perhaps tying it again to what Virat has done, civil society no longer has to champion the cause of free software. Microsoft today organizes the meetings of the PHP user group in Bangalore. So Microsoft is even bigger champion of free software than we can ever be. So that's completely given over to our corporate friends. With WikiLeaks, it is precisely when you try and shut down certain behavior on the internet that it gets worse. So they tried to prevent Aaron Swartz from releasing 5 million public domain scholarly articles, and the reaction to his suicide is a movement called PDF Tribute. These are scholars releasing material that is currently under copyright. It's just like the authors who went to Delhi University and signed photocopies of their books. The authors are now taking the side of the consumers or the users. And to quickly answer Professor Crowley's question, if you take such technical measures, unfortunately, Professor Crowley, you balkanize the internet.
Ajit?
One question which came up, but I thought I heard it right, saying why can't architects and doctors and others, so normal civil society people, participate in these decision making? That's a question. I would say that's an anti-democratic view. The way the system works, if I may explain that, we all go and vote. Okay, we elect representatives who become, some of them become ministers, and some of them become members of parliament, and they go and decide these things for us. By saying that I want architects and lawyers and others to come in and be part of the debate, you're being anti-democratic. You're saying let the system work. Do not lose faith. I know it's popular among the Indian westernized middle class to say all those politicians are corrupt. I know what to do. I'm pleading with you. Just trust democracy and make it work.
Thank you. So let me just answer that. actually one by one. So firstly, I thought that question was an important one, the one, can we have citizens engage with this? And just to add to what Mr. Balakrishnan said, actually there are multiple ways of looking at it, and democracy 2.0 just doesn't depend only on MPs. MPs themselves don't only depend on themselves. They hold standing committee hearings. I've occasionally taken part of them. I'm sure people in this room have also done that. But what's interesting is that example isn't as outlandish as it seems. In Brazil, for example, a country with whom we often have very close bonds politically and in terms of strategic relations, Brazil has what's called the Marco Civil, the Bill of Civil Rights for the Internet. It's something that's not just created by crazy activists, bored lawyers and professors. It's something that's been created by different people, taken by the government and actually considered as a legislative proposal. So to answer your question, I think it's possible. It's about taking existing institutions, MPs, governments and others, and making it even more participatory. I don't believe they're not participatory. I do believe it can be done even more so. And that benefits public administrators as well, because they want effective regulations. Nobody really wants ineffective regulation. The other important point was about international norms and different social perspectives. I completely agree, it can vary, but I think many countries, especially ones like ours who are part of the UN system, have said you can actually create international standards, and we've done that. We voted on one. In fact, I encourage you to go and see it. Your government voted on this, and your government said concretely what it wants in terms of international free speech protection, not just for India, but what can apply globally within what you call it a band. So specific decisions might be made locally, but overall bans can be set internationally, and that's what the Human Rights Council did, and I'm very proud to say with India's leadership. The last one, an important question on innovation and tech perspective. And I agree, and I think all the illustrations, they were apples, so I could object to that. But I think there's lots of innovation possible. The point is, again, what sort of innovation do you want? So for example, you can have somebody create an auto filter that would pick up every word. For a while, for example, my campus when I was studying law did that. Unfortunately, therefore, whenever I wanted to access the Virginia Law Review, it got blocked. You can even make more sophisticated filters, but the point is what you apply it for. Sometimes you can apply a filter for a certain case, a technological solution. In other cases, it's inappropriate. You don't want to go there. Engineers can do it for you, but they'll actually say, do you really want us to do this? This may not be perfect. And when you talk about speech and expression, I believe that engineering solutions are important and critical, but ultimately I look more towards our constitution for answers there. And one last word, I want to just leave it there since everyone's had a couple of interesting words to throw. The Australians have a saying, keep the boys honest, except boys is replaced by another word referring to one's parentage. It's a phrase they use to talk about large companies and politicians, and I think that's an important thing you see in here. There are important debates between companies, civil society and government on many things, but very often, surprisingly, I don't believe they're at conflict. So for example, many companies believe that it's important to protect privacy because if you don't have customers' data private and secure, they're not going to use it. So for example, Google, and I'm happy to plug this product, Google allows you to authenticate using what's called two-factor authentication. That means that you get a one-time password to access your account. Why did we do that? We saw governments actually compromising people's email accounts. But then many people said this is a great service, roll it out globally. So these conversations always take place. I think sometimes you can agree. For example, Sunil gave a great example of when US NGOs agreed with their government on something. Other times they disagree. So for example, US NGOs disagree with the federal government about intellectual property negotiations globally. The point is, I think this open, frank discussion is critical to it. But the point is we must realize when we can build a common cause on something.
Okay, thank you very much. We've had panelists come in from Oxford, London, Bangalore, Mumbai and Gurgaon, and I think the journey from Gurgaon must have been the most difficult. But I must thank all our panelists for being here today and giving us a wonderful evening and a debate which will continue. I must thank all of you for your attention, for being here, and from the Editors Guild, from the Index on Censorship, and from the Indian National Centre. Thank you very much.